Welcome to Urban Knife Guy, where we discuss knives for city dwellers. Today we're going to talk about the British Army knife, or at least this version of the knife, and we'll see if it makes for a good urban EDC, that's everyday carry. And then we'll compare it to the Singapore Army Jackknife and see how that knife stacks up with this knife. But first, let's talk about this version of the British Army knife. It was first introduced in 1952. The knife is made in the city of Sheffield that has been a world centre of fine knife making since the 14th century. The brand Joseph Rodgers has a long history as well. No one seems to be sure when Joseph actually started as a cutler and maker of pocket knives, but his sons Maurice and Joseph inherited the business in 1730, so that's quite a while back. The company went on to become one of the biggest cutlers in the world and were appointed Royal Cutler to 5 successive sovereigns: George IV, William IV, Queen Victoria, Edward II, and George V. The brand has been owned by the Egginton Group since 1986. But let's check out the knife first. As you can see, the packaging is very simple. A simple white cardboard box with some billboarding, quite thin cardboard as well. And inside we have the knife wrapped up in some waxed paper. There's a warning label and with some product information, which is mainly information on the Joseph Rodgers brand and the heritage. And inside over here, we have the knife itself. As you can see, it's really a solid piece of metal. It is quite heavy. I'll get through specs in just a bit, but I should mention, finding information on this particular knife is quite scarce online. To put together information from different sources, and the same goes for the Singapore Army Jackknife. But I think I've got enough information to share in this video so that we can all learn about both knives. Now, this particular knife is really commissioned by the British Ministry of Defence. So it's made to their exacting requirements, and there's actually a NATO stock number, and that's 7340-99975-7403. So the Ministry of Defence describes it as a general purpose class knife for cutting, tin opening and rigging tasks. It also comes with this integrated screwdriver. I guess you could see it as a pry bar. So basically, in a sense, it is a multi-tool. So there are actually 3 variants of this particular knife. So this is the 2-piece British Army clasp knife. So this is actually the one that I'm most familiar with as well. And before we open it up, let's just have a look at the billboarding here. So the genuine British Army knife, stainless steel, made in Sheffield, England. So it features a sheepfoot blade, as you can see. And it is actually very sharp out of the box. This has actually bitten me once. So this is the 2-piece because it's got 2 main tools. That's the sheepfoot blade over there. And this has got a really strong back spring. And there's also this can opener. And as mentioned, the back spring is very strong and it can be quite hard to open. And this actually works. It's a bit different from the Victorinox can opener, but you can open it. But I do prefer the Victorinox can opener. Now, as mentioned, this has very strong back spring, and this is a slip joint knife. Okay, so there's no locking mechanism, but very strong back spring. The second version of the knife is similar to this, but in the late 1990s, the Ministry of Defence decided that this knife needed a locking blade. So it's essentially exactly the same, slightly smaller, but it features a lock back. So you actually have to press it to unlock the blade. And the third version of the knife is a 3-piece British Army clasp knife. So it's exactly like this one, but there's an addition of a marling spike, which is a metal spike that hinges open. And the marling spike is really used for rope work. So when you're on a ship and there's rope tied with knots, many knots in fact, you use the marling spike to put it into the knot to kind of pry open and loosen the knot. So that's the purpose of that. So let's talk about the specs of this particular knife. The material of this knife is built as stainless steel, And there's really no information on exactly what steel it is, what's this mysterious blade steel as well. However, I did find out that the blade steel is actually 420HC, so 0.45 to 0.55 carbon, treated to a hardness of 54 to 55 HRC. So the whole idea is to give reasonable edge retention, but retain the toughness so it doesn't break. It is a working knife. The edge retention is, well, I won't say for this knife, but at least for the Singapore Army knife, which I'll show later, definitely the edge retention is not good, but might not be the same metal. So as mentioned, blade style is the sheep's foot. There is a nail nick to open it up. It's a non-locking blade, so slip joint. The blade length is 70 mm, so just about 3 inches. The handle length is 95 mm, and this blade thickness is 2 mm. Now the weight, well, there's no information on the weight, so let's just give it a weigh. I did see one source says about 100 grams. So that's, yep, that is just over 100 grams, 104 grams, and in ounces, that's 3.68 ounces. So it is a bit of a hefty knife for what it is, and it definitely feels hefty, heavy, and solid. And as mentioned, 3 tools, there's the blade, can opener, and this pry tool. So this is the British Army knife. Remember, I talked about the Singapore Army Jackknife. And why am I talking about it in this particular video? Just let me show you how it looks like. This is the Singapore Army Jackknife, or at least the one that they issued to soldiers all the way to about 2000. So in Singapore, they would issue this to recruits, and there's no information on when this started to be issued. Okay. My guess, at least from the 80s or maybe even earlier. Now, if we look at the knife, there's different billboarding. It says stainless steel. There's this arrow of 68. It does say 1968, so that's probably what that refers to. And it just says oil the joints. And that is it. And if you look, the construction is exactly almost identical to the British Army knife. So this is also the two-piece version. So there is the blade and the can opener, and this kind of a screwdriver pry bar. You'd also notice that the rivets are actually smaller on the Singapore Army Jackknife. And that's really what it's referred to, right? There's no proper name, but everyone called it a jackknife. And if we just try to open it and compare, this particular knife that I have here actually opens up quite smoothly, which surprises me. So let me tell you a bit about my experience with this jackknife. So when I was serving national service in the military, I wasn't actually issued this knife, and that's just the way, because of how I was enlisted. But other people who I met along the way all had this particular jackknife. So I would look at it and I would kind of, fiddle around with it. And the thing I always felt from the start, it had a horrible backspring, or at least horrible in the sense that it was so tough to just open. It was so uncomfortable to open, but this one actually, for some reason, is very smooth. So this wasn't my own knife. I did buy this on the secondary market. But the original British Army knife definitely resembles more of the knife that I remember. Extremely very tough, not very user-friendly, because you need the nail nick for example, the can opener. You really have to get the nail in, and that can be tough. But this particular knife, at least the one that I have here now, opens much easier. The blade is the same style, but there are some differences. So first off, the blade length is minutely shorter. This is just under 70 mm. This blade, as you can see right there, in terms of the grind and the bevel, this is actually a chisel grind. It's only ground on one side, so it's actually different. And maybe that affects the edge retention, because in my experience, the edge retention for the Singapore Jackknife was just, it was not there. It's not even this one. Yeah, it's not sharp at all. You really have to sharpen it well to get this in good working order. But then I also felt that it dulled very easily, especially out in the field. While I felt this knife and I used this knife, it was not a knife I definitely wanted to use. I would use it only because I needed to. Maybe I didn't have a knife on me. I had to borrow someone's knife and I'd use it. But it was never a joy to use this particular knife. Back then, I was using this knife, which is the Buck 422. And I was spoilt, I think, by this knife, just in the way, the ease of opening and just how it performed. So this I felt was not a good knife. And of course, I was using Victorinox Swiss Army knives as well. So it couldn't compare to this. However, this was very solid, right? I mean, I guess for a soldier's knife out in the field, this is very solid. It could take all kinds of abuse. This says it's stainless steel. Now, remember I mentioned this was 420C. This, we have no idea. This is stainless steel. I think the biggest mystery is who even made this particular knife. If you see here, it says Japan on the knife. So the question is this really made in Japan, or is this actually made in China? And at the time, and I guess even now to a certain extent, China would make copies of knives, and they would put Japan or whoever, it was made. They wouldn't put made in China necessarily. So it really depends on what was specified. Now, this was issued by the Singapore Army, right? Singapore Armed Forces. But again, no idea when this was issued. Was it issued in 1968, as it says? Why is this year 1968 so specific? From research, the British Army knife was created or introduced in 1952. So this came several years later, which makes sense. But why does it seem to be an exact copy? I think that's a simple answer, and that is because Singapore was a British colony, so a lot of British influence, and therefore it makes sense that the knife they would choose, or the army would choose at the time, would follow the British knife. At least that's what I think makes sense. Then maybe they couldn't afford, or it's just too troublesome to get the original British knife, so they commissioned someone else to supply this particular knife, and I believe really modeling after the British Army knife. So is it made in China or made in Japan? So I did a bit of digging. So in Japan, one of the famous steels from Japan is the OS series, and that is made by Aichi Techno Metal Fukami Company Limited. And here's the kicker. The OS series of high-grade stainless steel cutlery was introduced in 1968. That seems like a really big coincidence if it is. So the billboarding on this knife is 1968. It says made in Japan. OS steel was introduced in 1968. I'm not sure if there's a connection or if it's a coincidence, but it's a really nice coincidence. Now, another idea of why this could really be made in Japan and not China is, well, it depends when it was made. Because in the 1980s, Shelham, which is an Australian company, actually made stainless steel knives for the Australian military force. And that was a similar type of knife. And these knives were actually made in Japan for the Australian Army. So if this was really introduced to the Singapore Army in, let's say, the 1980s, possibly they could have followed the cue of the Australians and got the Japanese to produce this knife. But of course, as I mentioned, it could just be a China knockoff or pirate, and that's why we can't really tell what the exact steel is. I know for a fact edge retention is not very good, and I also know while it's a stainless steel, it still tends to rust. And you can see there's actually a bit of rust over here. So this knife itself, I know it's old. This knife is at least, well, from the 1990s. But there is rust, very little maintenance. I think it was probably brought out in the field at one time, cleaned up, and probably left there. But I have seen rust on this, not this knife, but other jackknives throughout my time in the army. So, what degree of chromium is inside here, how stainless is the steel. But this is the British Army knife. This is the Singapore jackknife. I guess the one thing also I just like to show is the weight of the Singapore jackknife is actually slightly lighter. So it's 3.41 grams, or ounces, 3.14 ounces, which is slightly lighter than this knife, and it's also slightly shorter, as I said, by just a bit. But I think the main differences could also be the blade steel itself, and even like the hardware, like the rivets. The British Army knife is, substantially bigger. So there you have it, a bit of history on the British Army knife and the Singapore Army knife. The question is, would you carry this as an urban EDC? And how would you actually carry these knives? I think if you have some kind of an EDC holder like I have over here, this is the Easy Ant leather organizer. You can see a review that I've done previously on this. This is big enough to accommodate this knife. So you could actually fit this in, and that looks quite nice, right? If you do not mind the weight. So that's pretty good. But I would think it probably fits a single knife sheath better, like this. This one is from QSP. That fits quite nice. You might need to flip this up, maybe put a lanyard, and that's just so that you can remove it easily. So that's just carrying it around. Of course, you can put it in your pocket as well, but it would definitely scratch up any other fragile items you might have in your pocket. But does it really function well as an EDC? I think if you talk about the British version or the Singapore version, if this back spring is that tough, even if you oil it, right? I've oiled this, I've tried to maintain it. It's still very tough to open. And I think in this day and age of, you know, modern knives, whether it's slip joints or locking knives, you know, and multi-tools, just having so much struggle opening a tool might not make sense. And same with this one. I mean, this is easier, but then again, you go with the same thing compared to, let's say, a Swiss Army knife, let's say Victorinox Spartan. This would be so much, you know, more user-friendly. The tools are just as good. You know, we might as well, at the same time, just compare a bit of the sizes over here. So compared to the, you know, standard Swiss Army knife, that's how it pairs up. Let's compare it with my buck knife over here, although this is a lock back, so not a slip joint. So let's look at another slip joint. This is the Boker Plus Tech 2 1. And then we have over here the Civivi Trailblazer. So it's all about, I guess, that same small to medium knife range, and I guess for the sake of completeness, as usual, let's just put in an Altoids tin. So that's the size of the British Army knife and the Singapore Jackknife itself. So let me know what you think in the comments. Do you think this makes for a good urban EDC? Would you carry this? For myself personally, I think part of being an urban EDC guy or urban knife guy really is also collecting. And I think since I do have some personal connection with the Singapore Army Jackknife, it makes sense to track down the British Army knife and just put it in, you know, as part of my collection, as part of my urban knife collection. But let me know your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever worked with any of these knives? What do you think of the back spring? Would you carry it as an EDC? Let me know in the comments below. If you liked the video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Thanks so much for watching. As usual, keep it folded, keep it safe.